Mitt Romney probably blew his chances of becoming president in May 2012 when he suggested to a room full of wealthy people at a Boca Raton, Florida fundraiser that America spoils its lower-income citizens by not taxing them enough. Now, Donald Trump has amplified Romney's error by explicitly stating that the progressive income tax ought to be replaced by tariffs. That would do Romney one better by returning the United States economy to the 1800s. During the 1800s, the federal government received its revenues not from income taxes, but from import tariffs. However, we then passed a constitutional amendment that allowed the taxation of income. During World War I, we raised taxes significantly, and especially to fight the Nazis and Japanese imperialism, we raised a lot of money through income taxes. These taxes continue to supply a large portion of the federal government's revenues, around 8 to 10% of GDP. Here's the issue. It is impossible to eliminate the revenues that come from income taxes and replace them with tariffs. In 2023, the individual income tax generated $2.2 trillion in federal revenue, while Americans imported $3.1 trillion in goods. Based on that level of imports, it would take a tariff rate of 71% to generate $2.2 trillion in federal revenue. According to U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, it would require tariffs well over 100%. Last week, President Biden announced 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and former President Trump reiterated his plan to put a 200% tariff on all auto imports from Mexico. This is intended to make it more expensive and difficult for Americans to buy these vehicles. Although his measure aims to protect and promote the growth of the U.S. electric vehicle industry, but you get the idea how tariffs generally make it difficult to import goods. If we slapped a 71% tax on all imports, the number of imports would not stay the same. Higher taxes mean higher prices, which means a decrease in quantity. Can trade tariffs be a major source of government revenue? To answer that question, we need to walk through this graph. It shows the percent of current government revenue that it is possible to raise via tariffs. The United States is at the bottom. The light red represents the maximum trade revenue before retaliation. If we slapped 50% tariffs or higher on other countries, they would start imposing tariffs on us, slowing down international trade. Less trade means fewer taxable transactions, represented in dark red as the maximum amount of revenue we could possibly raise via tariffs. Here's the thing about trade. The benefits from it go towards lower and middle class American households. Poorer consumers, 10th percentile, generally benefit more from trade than richer consumers, 90th percentile, in every country. When trade is restricted, low-income individuals lose more compared to high-income individuals. Poorer people spend more on heavily traded goods, while wealthier people spend more on services, which are less traded. Poorer consumers also buy goods from sectors with less substitution between imports and domestic products, gaining more from trade. Gains vary significantly between countries, with poorer consumers in countries like Estonia and Hungary seeing the highest benefits. This graph measures the benefits of trade. In dark blue, we see the bottom 20% of households. The poor among us see the largest benefits from trade. This graph looks at what would happen if trade were completely gone. The poor would lose most of their purchasing power because the prices of goods and services would go up, affecting them the most. In the United States, in blue, it shows the bottom 10% would lose well over 60% of their purchasing power. The median American would lose 37% of their purchasing power, and even the top 90% would lose out as well. Trump's policies, including tax cuts and proposed tariffs, are regressive. If we implement 10% tariffs across the board, we find that consumption for the lowest quintile would decline by 4%. For the top quintile, it would be minus 2%, and for the top 1%, it would be less than 1%. The wealthiest benefit the most from tax cuts, while the proposed tariffs disproportionately hurt lower income groups. Overall, these policies increase after-tax income for the rich, but reduce it for the poor and middle class, making the fiscal agenda more favorable to high-income individuals. Here's another estimate from an economist. If we lower the income tax and replaced it with a tariff, everyone would have lower incomes except the top 10% and especially the top 1%. Here's why. About half of Americans hardly pay any income tax. The average income tax rate for the bottom 50% is only 3%, whereas the average income tax rate for the top 10% is 25%. Now you can see why some people want to get rid of the income tax and replace it with tariffs, which more heavily tax the poor and middle classes. A large tariff on our friends, allies, and neighbors will lower GDP and economic income for everyone. It will increase the burden on the poor and middle class, reduce innovation and exchange, and decrease overall prosperity. Everything would cost more, the economy would tank, unemployment would skyrocket, and the middle class would cease to exist.